It's the best place to work in the federal government. It has its sights deep into the universe. Yet NASA has some big down-to-earth challenges. A National Academies team looked closely at NASA and found too much focus on the short term and a mismatch, it said, of work and funding, among other things. The chairman of the Committee on NASA Mission Critical Workforce, Infrastructure and Technology, Norm Augustine, joins me in studio. Mr. Augustine, good to have you join us.
Nice to be here, Alan. Thank you.
And actually, this is not the first time you've looked at NASA. About 15 years ago, a similar committee study was done. Are things better or worse, do you think, than 15 years ago?
Well, actually, this is my third study of NASA. The first one was for President Bush Sr., second one for President Obama, and then this one for the Congress. And if I look back to those first two, they had a conclusion that if I were to make it very simplistic, that kind of leads to the result of this study that you just mentioned. If I were to, as I say, oversimplistically define the conclusions of those first two studies, it was that the problem with NASA is it always seems to have about $3 billion a year more program than it has money. And the way it has kept conducting great missions and successful programs over the years has been shortchanging the future of NASA, to put it bluntly. And that's happened by taking money and put it into missions that normally would have gone into laying the groundwork, the foundation for future missions. And obviously this is not something that is unique to NASA. It's a hazard for all businesses. But the day comes, if you follow a going out of business strategy, eventually you go out of business. And NASA, as much as it's accomplishing today, is really rather hollow when you look to the future.
It sounds almost like what some reports recently have said of the U.S. military. With the high pace of operations, the future is a big problem, as is the real lethality in the eyes of would-be enemies. Absolutely
true. And if you look back at the end of the Cold War, you recall we were going to have the peace dividend, and Pentagon began taking actions, and the industry did, to bring about a peace dividend. And so there is a parallel. NASA has been extremely successful in the meantime, and that leads to all the more complacency. But I've been very encouraged when we've spoken with and briefed the leadership of NASA that I think they really have a constructive approach to this issue.
Well, before we get to that, I wanted to ask you how the research was done. Did you look at the books and the budgets, or was it interviews with people?
A great question. We asked NASA when we were assigned this job by the Congress to let us not just read reports and go to briefings, but we want to go out in the field and touch things and see things. And our committee had 13 members. We went to all 9 NASA centers and the FDRC, FRDC, Federal Research and Development Center. We spent 2 days at each, and we had a number of briefings. We talked to over 400 employees, from the center directors to the people who worked there 2 weeks. And we were up on top of towers that were rocket test towers. And we found ourselves down in tunnels underground that provided utilities. And so I think we had a pretty good scrub of what NASA has to offer. And, of course, the 13 members of the group all had backgrounds with NASA, from being an astronaut to working for NASA to, in my case, having been around NASA a lot at the outside.
Sure. And these conclusions that the committee came to, that NASA is living in the present and borrowing against the future and so forth, would that conclusion be a surprise to the people you spoke with, or pretty much they probably knew this all along and it's Congress and other elements of the government that need to know it?
I think it was a lot the latter, that this is one of those things that has been going on all the way since the Columbia accident, if you trace back. And people have been shifting attention and money from mission support to missions, and you can only do that so long. Just to give you an example, Tom, of if you look at the NASA infrastructure, the average piece of infrastructure in NASA, 83% of those pieces of infrastructure are beyond the design life of that piece. And if you look at the balance between missions and mission support, since 2010, the mission budget has increased by 8% in real dollars, constant purchasing power, whereas the mission support budget has decreased by 33%, which, if you do the arithmetic, will show that a dollar of mission support today has to go 50% further than it did 14 years ago.
We're speaking with Norm Augustine. He is, of course, the former chairman of Lockheed Martin and also chairman of the National Academies Committee studying NASA. And when you say mission support, that would include the infrastructure of things that are used over and over again by a mission, and also the information technology infrastructure?
Exactly. It would be everything that kind of cuts across all missions at NASA. And we also looked at the human resources at NASA. We looked at the technology circumstances, and we looked at something that we chose to call systemics. Our charter that was given to us was to look at those first three areas, but it also said to look at things that cut across the various, those three ingredients or those three assets. And we looked at organizational structure and things of that type under systemics.
Right, and just to talk about one example of infrastructure that you mentioned, and that is like the platforms, the towers, these bridge-like structures that support. Those do age, in other words, just by simply being used to test rockets. They don't last forever.
Exactly. They not only age, but they cost more to maintain as they age. And as we sit here today, the NASA backlog for maintenance is $3.3 billion. That's a fair-sized piece of change. And if NASA stays, and NASA and the Congress and the OMB, I should say, if they stay on the course that we've been on the last decade or so, the average piece of NASA infrastructure will even out, level out at 320 years old. And NASA, their target is 60 years. In industry, you'd be a lot less than that, and particularly in the high-tech industry. So just to put it kind of simply, it's been a case of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, and Peter's about to run out of money to borrow.
Right, and I guess this is especially pressing at a time when the ability and the capacity to get into space is so diffuse among industry in the United States and also among rival nations.
Absolutely. China today is, as I'm sure you know, has put mobile vehicles on Mars. It's landed on the backside of the moon, which nobody else has done yet. It's got its own space station, and it's said that it's going to put people on the moon in 2030. And China, whatever its faults, one of the things in the space program is it's pretty well done what it said it was going to do. So I think there's reason to be concerned about China. And the problem with what NASA does, it's so unforgiving that the slightest error can have dire consequences. And just a couple quick examples, of course, if you look at just a simple seal that doesn't function properly and is used out of its normal envelope, and where you do a poor job of communicating those problems through within the NASA system, that led to the failure of the Challenger, and 7 astronauts lost. And you go to the Columbia, where a little piece of foam, the size of a small chair maybe, a piece of foam comes loose, and you lose 7 more astronauts, and you lose the Columbia. My most extreme example was on the mission to Venus, Mariner 1, some years ago. A software writer left out a dash in one piece of thousands of lines of code. And it was a piece of backup code not even expected to be used, but as bad luck would have it, when flight that piece was needed and the mission was lost because of the missing dash. And that's sort of every day at NASA. Perfection has got to be the lowest standard.
We're speaking with Norm Augustine. He is the former chairman of Lockheed Martin and chairman of the National Academies Committee that is studying NASA. We were talking about infrastructure. I wanted to talk about the human capital issue. I think in one of the big findings is that you said NASA should exercise extreme caution with its dependence, its